Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And before I start, I'd like to let all viewers know, unfortunately, I will be heading out of town again on business. This time, I'll be heading to the Silicon Valley in California. So I'll be there for about a week. I anticipate that I will be producing content while I'm out there. I intend to do that. But again, if I miss a day or two, that is the reason why. I am away from my home base, my normal office, and I will be out west. So, on to the coverage of the continued war taking place. So we're seeing a lot of coverage in the mainstream media about this KH-22, the supposed Russian carrier killer cruise missile that was used against this apartment building in Dnipro. The mainstream media, the way many of these articles are worded, would have you believe that the Russian Federation intentionally targeted this apartment block. So I guess the question is why would Russia waste one of these missiles against one apartment block? In all likelihood, it was engaged by Ukrainian air defense systems. It may have had an internal error in which it went off course, much like U.S. Tomahawks do. Obviously, this is a different system, not the same as a Tomahawk. But nonetheless, it was both, in all probability, engaged by Ukrainian ground forces and or just a system error that had it unfortunately hit this large apartment block, resulting in the casualties of a number of Ukrainian civilians. In other news, we continue now to hear about and receive intelligence that indicates the Russian Federation is about to get very, very serious about this ongoing war. For some time, it has been called a special military operation, and it is still called a special military operation. Now, with that being said, it does look like that the Russians are preparing to take the mentality of win at all cost. Now, what does winning look like? We simply do not know in terms of what that would look like in terms of the capturing of territory. Is the Russians just looking at taking localized territory such as Donetsk and Luhansk? Or are the Russians looking to capture even greater areas of Ukraine? I would say that if this conflict were to end, this war were to end, with the Russians only seizing Luhansk and Donetsk, that the Russians would probably walk away feeling, many outside observers as well, believing that the Russians were defeated in this campaign. So I think going into this war, the Russians had some very specific goals. Their first goal, obviously, was seizing control of this land corridor running from the Donbass to the Crimea. That was achieved. Their secondary objective, some Russian supporters believe that this was a diversionary effort, an attack towards Kiev. I do not believe it was a diversionary effort. I think it was an attack designed to seize control of Kiev. And unfortunately for the Russians, they faced much more stiffer resistance than initially believed, and they were not able to seize control of Kiev. The other objective other two objective was the seizure of Kharkov. The Russians were able to make it just inside of Kharkov, just outside of Kharkov. They were looking to envelop Kharkov before they decided to pull back. And then finally, depending on how operations went, it was very apparent that the Russians were looking to seize control of Odessa and quite possibly move the border area all the way to the border of Moldova and the Transnistria region. So I would have to say at this moment that the Russian war goals, war aims, probably no longer include Odessa. That would be a very difficult military objective for the Russians, considering what is happening right now on the ground. Next, Kiev. Is Kiev still a viable target for the Russians? Possibly, but unlikely. We could see something occur along the Belarusian-Ukraine border that this time, I believe, would be a diversionary effort, but an all-out Russian attack with the goal of seizing control of Kiev at this point, I think is outside the realm of military capability. Now, depending on what things look like a year from now, we can have another look at that. Depending on how this Russian mobilization continues and how the Russian military-industrial complex responds to what's happening right now. And then finally, and I've talked about this before, Kharkiv. Whichever side of the fence you're on, say it as you wish. But I still think Kharkov is a goal for the Russians in this ongoing campaign. I furthermore believe that within the inner circles of the Kremlin, the military goal right now is to seize all territory east of the Dnieper River, with at least the seizure of Luhansk, Donetsk, maintaining the land corridor towards the south, and then eventually seizing control of Kharkov. But ultimately, in all probability, the preparations that we're now seeing that are underway inside of Russia point towards a more expanded operation designed to seize all areas east of the Dnieper River. Now, if you're on the Ukrainian side, we continue to hear a lot about the Ukrainians wanting or desiring to seize control of all territory, to include the Crimea. Basically, expel the Russians from Luhansk, expel the Russians from Donetsk, expel the Russians from areas around Melitopol, east of Kherson, and then eventually move in and evict the Russians from Crimea. It's not going to happen. And as long as the president of Ukraine continues to discuss the idea that that is one of the military goals, this conflict is never going to end. Furthermore, I mean, look, the Ukrainians have to face it. Russia is not going to disappear. It is going to be there. It is going to be omnipresent forever. Now, support from the United States, support from Western nation states, that can ebb and decrease. And in all probability, it will. The United States is not going to continue to supply Ukraine with an unlimited reservoir of capital. can't afford it. And eventually, what is right now a unlimited reservoir of military equipment and capital is going to dry up. And the Russians are still going to be here. Then what? The Ukrainians act as if they drive the Russians out of Luhansk, Donetsk, defeat the Russian land corridor from Mariupol running to Crimea, and then move towards Crimea. Well, that's going to be it. War done, everybody goes home and is happy. That is not what's going to happen under the best case scenario for the Ukrainians. Because right now, what's happening inside of Russia is the gearing up for total war, and even the prospect of fighting other Western nation states. Russia is preparing for that very possibility right now. We're hearing about the expansion of the Russian armed forces upwards to more than 2 million personnel, greatly increasing, and most of these forces are going to be going towards ground forces, airborne forces, naval infantry forces, National Guard forces, boots on the ground. And then compounding that is the gearing up of the Russian military-industrial complex. That is really starting to be put in gear for a protracted conflict. But not only a protracted conflict, it is preparing to field Russian forces, Russian maneuver groups, Russian army groups, division, corps-sized forces, the likes of which we have not seen since World War II. The likes of which would be seen pre-Soviet collapse. And at this point, the inner circles in the Kremlin have decided that is their only option. And in all probability, given the rhetoric coming from Kiev, the Zelensky regime, in all probability, the Kremlin is now very closely looking at the possibility that their only option would be to go all the way to Kiev. And they're preparing for that eventuality, military, resources-wise. Now, is that going to be an eventual goal? Difficult to say. But right now, the Russians are gearing up to seize control of all areas east of the Dnieper River. I think right now that's their operational plan. Now, again, we're talking about a plan that in all probability will not happen until summer, late summer, I believe. And I've talked about that before. This idea that the Russians are going to launch this massive offensive around spring, I don't think they're going to be ready. I do think towards the end of this summer, things are going to look a lot different for the Russians. And that's not going to bode well for the Ukrainians. But the Russians continue to hammer Ukrainian forces with these cruise missile, ballistic missiles. They are wearing down the Ukrainians. They are going after both their military infrastructure. Look, the Ukrainians don't report on military targets that have been hit by the Russians. They only talk about civilian targets that have been hit. And for operational security needs for the Ukrainians, I understand why they're doing that. But while the mainstream media reports that you see these catastrophic hits on civilian targets, such as the apartment block in Dnipro, you better believe that many, many more Ukrainian command and control targets, military targets, are being hit by the Russians. It's just not being talked about. And for their part, the Ukrainians are kind of doing the same thing. There are civilian targets being hit in Luhansk and Donetsk, but the media doesn't talk about that. Now, are the Ukrainians intentionally targeting civilian areas? Probably not. They're probably going after what they perceive as valid military targets. Now, you would say that the going after the civilian infrastructure is not a valid military target. Well, it is. In a total war scenario where you're trying to break the will of a nation state to fight, much like the United States did against the Germans in World War II and the Japanese, it is part of war. It's what happens. So that's it for today. We will have more very, very soon. We're continuing to watch what is happening in Bakhmut. We are continuing to watch what is happening to the west of Soledar now. We are continuing to watch what is happening in Avdiivka and areas west of Donetsk as well. We are continuing to monitor the possibility of both either a Ukrainian offensive and or a Russian offensive running either from Zaporizhia or even further north towards Kharkov, Chernihiv, Sumy, other areas as well. So stay tuned, more content to come. Thank you for joining us today, and as always, have a good day.